Few settings evoke a sense of peace like taking a trip to the mountains. Whether it be for a day with friends or a weekend getaway to escape the noise of city life, the mountains have always been a place that makes me feel at home. Learning more about these mountains I love is something I've always come to appreciate. That's one of the reasons why I joined this podcast, to learn more about different mountain regions and deliver it right to your ears. I'm Ethan Ward, and you're listening to the Canadian Mountain Podcast. In this episode, we'll be talking about the Canadian Mountain Assessment and how mountain assessments are important in understanding what we know, what we don't know, and what we still need to learn in relation to Canada's diverse mountain regions. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to appreciate the land that we work on and the people we work with. The Canadian Mountain Podcast acknowledges that our conversations engage with diverse knowledge holders who live and work on unceded and treatied lands. We also recognize the historical and ongoing oppression that many Indigenous cultures, lands, and nations have continuously faced within Canada. This podcast actively seeks to decolonize, change, and inspire media platforms by including Indigenous ways of knowing. Canadian Mountain Assessments is the flagship project with the Canadian Mountain Network, which is led by Principal Investigator Dr. Graham Mcdowell, who is supported by a team of international and Canadian advisors that help steward the project as it moves forward. The assessment is the first of its kind in Canada, and the first in the world to put a primary focus on working and collaborating with Indigenous peoples. Together, the team seeks to learn what we know about mountains, what we don't know about mountains, and what we need to know in order to maintain them going forward. On this episode of the Canadian Mountain Podcast, I spoke with three individuals who make up part of the Canadian Mountain Assessment. Our first guest is the Principal Investigator of the assessment, Dr. Graham Mcdowell.
My name is Graham Mcdowell. I'm the project leader of the Canadian Mountain Assessment. I'm joining you today from Canmore, Alberta, which is on Treaty 7 territory. That being the traditional and ancestral territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nation. And I want to start by acknowledging the many Indigenous peoples who have lived on and cared for these lands for generations, and really just say how privileged I feel to be able to live, work, and play in these incredible mountain areas with my family.
Our second guest is Dr. Carolina Adler, who joined us from Zurich, Switzerland, and is one of the members of the International Advisory Committee on the assessment.
My name is Carolina Adler. I'm currently joining this conversation from Zurich, where I live, also in Switzerland. By way of background, I am a geographer and environmental scientist. I've trained and worked mostly in Australia and New Zealand, Australia being the country in which I grew up.
Our third and final guest is Dr. Philippus Wester, who joined us from Kathmandu, Nepal, and is another member of the International Advisory Committee, providing guidance on the project based on his extensive work with other mountain assessments, specifically the Hindu Kush assessments that examined the Himalayas mountain range.
Yeah, I'm Flip Wester in Kathmandu, Nepal. The place I live is actually called Lalitpur, originally the land of the Newa, the Newar, the original inhabitants of Kathmandu Valley.
I met up virtually with Graham, Carolina, and Philippus to discuss their roles in the Canadian Mountain Assessment, as well as their thoughts on the outcomes and results that will come from the assessment once completed. So, as we know, this is all about the Canadian Mountain Assessment. So for the people who are going to be listening to this, Graham, can you introduce us to the Mountain Assessments, the Canadian Mountain Assessment, and what exactly that is?
Sure thing, Ethan. Thanks. So the CMA is geared towards providing a first-of-its-kind look at the state of knowledge of mountains in Canada. And really what we're aiming to do is answer three fundamental questions, namely, what do we know, not know, and need to know about Canada's diverse, but also rapidly changing mountain systems. And so to answer these questions, we are drawing on findings from a systematic review of the pertinent academic literature, but also insights from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit knowledges of mountains. And so here, the Canadian Mountain Assessment is really inspired by some of the previous assessments of mountains that have been conducted, namely the Hindu Kush Himalaya Assessment and IPCC Mountains chapters. But we have a specific focus also on developing and mobilizing an inclusive knowledge co-creation methodology to support the inclusion of Indigenous peoples and knowledges in advancing our collective understanding of mountains in this country. And so what that means in practice is that the CMA is being envisioned, governed, and conducted by a diverse group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals who are working together to enhance the relevance, integrity, and positive impact of this project. But I want to say at the outset, we do this work together, but we do it imperfectly. We nevertheless do it with a shared aspiration of pushing the needle forward on finding ways of working respectfully across knowledge systems. And for all of us, this requires a really high degree of humility, of receptiveness to the deep learning involved in this process, including unlearning, and openness to the idea of proceeding imperfectly as we're navigating some of the inherent complexities and sensitivities that we're encountering along this journey. So this is a 3.5-year project. It's funded primarily by the Canadian Mountain Network, but we also receive funding from the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of the Canadian government. And we're about 2 years into the project at this point in time.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So, Philippus and Carolina, you both sit on the International Advisory Committee for the Canadian Mountain Assessment. What does this mean for you?
Ethan, I would say this, being invited to the International Advisory Committee of the Canadian Mountain Assessment, I think something like 2 years back, 2.5 years back, was a real honor, and I was, first off, really thrilled to hear that, there was a group of people in Canada wanting to do a specific Canadian mountain assessment, because I just think that's, it's so important that we have much better understanding of our mountain regions globally around the world. And, historically, very few of these focused mountain assessments have taken place. So there's some real knowledge gaps there, including what Graham was already mentioning, the Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledges, being brought to the table. So for me, it's just been, coming from the Hindu Kush Himalaya, the Asian context, and then to learn and to sit on the advisory committee to listen in on the discussions in Canada and the Canadian Mountain Assessment has been really enriching, I would say, and really generated ideas for where we could go next here in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region.
And for me, I guess one of the main things to add to what's already been said, for me personally, what this means for me is an opportunity to engage in a different context with a number of different other stakeholders for how the assessment itself is taken up be it for policy or for additional research or for outreach more generally within the Canadian context, and to learn about what priorities there are also and expectations that there are for assessment results such as these. Having been involved more at the global level, it's interesting to then zoom in and hone in to see how these assessments are taken up in a more regional and even national context. So it's been a great opportunity to expand that knowledge and to learn, and at the same time also exchange and contribute with my colleagues to support the assessment in Canada.
So, Graham, it was in 2020 that the Canadian Mountain Assessment really began to unfold. As you said, it's been going for 2 years. So what were your initial thoughts when you first started the project?
Ethan, I think I was equally excited and daunted at that point in time. I was really excited about this opportunity to be involved with the first formal national scale assessment of mountains in Canada. I was also really excited about the opportunities for some methodological development in the knowledge co-creation space, and also quite excited about the interesting people that I know I was going to get to know or to know better in the course of the project, including folks like Carolina and Flip. And as a mountain researcher, I'd say I was also really excited about this idea that when the project was completed, we were going to have new and foundational insights into the state of mountains in Canada. And so I found all of those facets really exciting and interesting. But at the same time, I was incredibly daunted. I was daunted about how to build the necessary relationships and cultivate the kind of trust that was going to be necessary to do this work in the context of a global pandemic. I started this project without access to any kind of office space, like many of us. Led the assessment out of the front seat of my car for 9 months, holding Zoom calls with folks all over the country and internationally to try to understand more about the kind of networks we would need and who to engage with, and to start building relationships. And frankly, that Zoom-based model has really continued through to today. So that's been a hugely daunting aspect of this project. I think I was also really daunted by the scope of the work ahead, based on some past experience with the IPCC and having a sense of what that entailed. But also, and in addition, the realization that we were really heavily focused on advancing, frankly, an as yet developed knowledge co-creation methodology. So really that kind of nexus of excitement and feeling daunted. But I think ultimately, I just felt really privileged to have the opportunity to be leading something like the Canadian Mountain Assessment.
All right, thank you. So we kind of did a brief project intro, or intro to the project. So now we'll kind of go into more of a general overview. So Graham, like I said, it's 2 years into the assessment now. Can you tell us more about your activities to date and what you view as some of the project's important accomplishments so far?
The first priority with the project was figuring out how it would be governed, who would be involved, and what that would look like. And ultimately, what we've decided on is what we call a stewardship circle. And this is the idea of moving a bit away from this more hierarchical model towards a more inclusive and equal governance model and knowledge sharing model. Key elements of that stewardship circle are the Canadian Advisory Committee and the International Advisory Committee. And both of those committees include leading Indigenous and non-Indigenous thinkers who are experienced in mountains, mountain assessments, but also things like knowledge co-creation activities. So that was really the first part of the project, figuring out how we would structure the governance and who would be involved. We then moved into conducting some foundational analyses, just so that we had a bit of a framework for how we would begin diving into something like a national scale assessment. And so we did some geospatial work. We looked at defining Canada's mountain areas spatially. One of the things that I found really interesting from that was the fact that the mountain areas of Canada will contain the whole of Switzerland 54 times. That was really interesting to me, and indicated the need for this kind of assessment. We have so many mountains in Canada. We then looked at developing some typologies for what the major mountain regions look like within that kind of large mountain area, so a more regional kind of analysis. Then looking at who lives in mountains, where do they live, how many people live there, what indigenous territories and linguistic regions are associated with mountains. A lot of analyses like this, just so that we had a bit of a framework for approaching the work. We then conducted a national scale systematic review of the peer-reviewed literature that is either explicitly or implicitly focused on mountains across all disciplines. And we came up with about 2,800 articles. And those are now available to our authors to work with in their assessment activities. I think we then really shifted back into this important conversation about the spirit and intent of the work, and here trying to articulate carefully our conceptual and ethical foundations. And in terms of our conceptual foundations, we really kind of landed on this idea of being inspired by what's called a multiple evidence-based approach. And the idea here is that for any given subject, you can enhance your understanding of that subject by drawing on multiple ways of knowing, multiple knowledge systems, and cultivating conversations across those knowledge systems to really learn from and share knowledge across ways of knowing, and to derive insights that you might not find by working within more circumscribed sets of evidence. A multiple evidence-based approach also provides an opportunity to think about braiding knowledges, and here importantly, not integrating knowledges towards any kind of one true understanding of mountains or assimilating knowledges, but really, again, bringing them into conversation, braiding them in a complementary way. And this is something that I think informs how we do this work and is something we aspire to. At the same time, we recognize that a deep knowledge braiding is something that requires an immense amount of time, an immense amount of trust, and we hope to move in that direction, but we don't certainly make any claims about doing that exhaustively or entirely sufficiently. But that's something that has emerged as a goal out of our conceptual foundations. Moving on from those foundations, we worked to co-develop the Canadian Mountain Assessments structure, and we came up with a number of sections that we feel pretty excited about. So, and I'll just tell you quickly how the assessment is structured. So we start with an introduction, and then we have a section on mountain environments. And instead of just jumping into something like geology, we open that section with origin stories about mountains. So really drawing on those indigenous understandings of mountains alongside some of these more scientific ways of thinking about mountain environments. So we have mountain environments, then we have mountains as homelands, a section called Gifts of the Mountains, moving on to a section that's focused on mountains under pressure, before a final substantive section that is called Desirable Mountain Futures. And then we wrap up with a concluding section. So that was a really interesting and fun process of kind of iteratively co-developing what the structure of the assessment would look like. We then moved on to identifying and inviting authors into the work. All sections of the mountain assessment include both Indigenous and non-Indigenous authors, and I just feel incredibly humbled by the incredible people that have stepped up to be authors on the assessment, and I continue to learn so much from them in all of our engagements together. So we moved into that space of actually getting folks to the table to do the work, and have more recently been focused substantively on actually preparing those sections. And so we are really focused on bringing these teams together, figuring out how they will engage effectively with the content from the systematic review and the literature, but also Indigenous knowledges of mountains, which are often underrepresented or sometimes misrepresented in that academic literature. And so we are coming up with other ways of engaging with those knowledges that I'll hopefully have a chance to speak to a bit later. And finally, more recently, we're really kind of setting in motion some of these plans for the future. So key future events, or finalizing some key project issues, things like publication and launch events, as we sort of move down our timeline, and those pieces become more important. And again, if there's a chance, I'll speak to some of that a bit later.
You touched on this a bit over the past couple of questions, Graham, but this is one of the first assessments, or this is the first assessment that is being done for Canada, as well as the first mountain assessment that includes Indigenous peoples and perspectives in the actual structure and process of the assessment, which you just went over, Graham. So this question is for all of you, but what would you say have been some of the things that this assessment has done to prioritize the inclusion of Indigenous peoples and their perspectives in the actual process?
Yeah, I'll come in on that, Ethan. Just to say that, being on the International Advisory Committee, we were, part right there at the beginning when, as Graham was saying, trying to figure out how to do this. But what I found very enriching and very, very powerful, that, at the very first meeting I joined, there were already elders in the room and Indigenous peoples in the room who had a very clear idea about if you like, this field of braiding knowledge and moving forward together. And I think, to me, what strikes me, kind of the tagline, "Nothing about us without us," so the rallying cry of many Indigenous peoples around the world is that, researchers, you no longer get to just speak on behalf of us or for us. We need to be part of that process. And I think that's really powerful, and I really commend the Canadian Mountain Assessment and Graham and the whole team and everybody involved with that Canadian Mountain Network, because I think the assessment, center right from the start, just right square and center, is saying respectfully and really trying to figure out how to bring these bodies of knowledge together, not integrating, but having multiple perspectives, and then having the faith that that will lead to a deeper understanding. Because I think our understanding potentially could be integrated. Knowledge is more difficult. So I think some of the things the assessment have done, well, I think a lot of the things the Canadian Mountain Assessment has done is right from the get-go is say, we need to take this very seriously. We need to, hear from other parts of the world. We need to really, go, explore how we can do this. And I think, actually, I know for sure from the region I'm based in, the Kush Himalaya, we actually have 1,000 cultures. 1,000 cultures, 1,000 languages, 1,000 peoples living in this mountain region, out of the 6,000 to 9,000 cultures total. Now, so you can imagine the diversity and the depth and the breadth and the history of knowledges contained in each language, which is so unique. Language is so unique, and if you've ever tried to learn 3 or 4 other languages, you quickly find out that conceptually, how you think, how you feel, how you dream is different in different languages. So we are closely watching what the Canadian Mountain Assessment is coming up with, very much in terms of process, but also in terms of content and what comes out of that, to take inspiration from that for the Hindu Kush Himalaya. So I just say that it's already been very an enriching experience. And I love the phrase, the gifts of the mountain, instead of services, and that already just gives you a kind of an insight in, we as humans, we might just want to be really thankful. We're getting all this stuff for free, and without it, our lives would be terrible. So it's not a service, it's a gift. And that in itself, I think, is such a conceptually powerful statement that is already coming out of the Canadian Mountain Assessment. And there's other thinking around nature's contributions to humanity or to humans, and again, it's contributions, and it's like, well, hang on, as if nature was created to contribute to humans. We're part of nature, but there's something sacred going on here, and to get deeper insight into that sacredness, I think is what the CMA is trying, and it's a best effort basis, and we're really looking forward to see where that goes.
Thanks for that, Flip, and that is an excellent response already to many of the items and aspects that I would also like to underscore and resonate very much with my own observations. And I think it comes down to the way in which this assessment has given a very prominent platform for Indigenous peoples to engage and have a governance structure that gives them that empowerment to also guide not just what content is addressed, but how. And as far as the way in which we also frame and conceptualize mountains, indeed, as Flip already mentioned, this is about shifting the mindset from receiving to people being a part of the natural system itself. And that is something that is important to have very well established and part of the structure of how the assessment is conducted. So this is something that this assessment has done incredibly well, and we look forward to seeing how that translates also to future efforts whereby Indigenous peoples continue to have that prominent say and ownership in that process as well. For me, interesting, it would be to see how the results of the assessment are taken up in other, say, political or policy arenas. I think that is a dialogue that's still yet to happen, and I would be very keen to see how these concepts translate to the more conventional ways in which we are dealing between the science and policy and those interfaces. So it's a space to watch, and I'm very hopeful that this will bring about new insights for how to improve also the science policy interface going forward.
I just wanted to quickly say, first of all, thanks, Flip and Carolina, for those reflections. It's really interesting, and helpful for me to hear your perspective on what this has looked like from your standpoint. I wanted to echo that point that Flip brought up about Indigenous peoples being involved from the outset, and really the idea, being that this is not an afterthought, or this is not something we're trying to bring in later in the process. We had Indigenous elders involved from the very beginning, and I think that's been a really fundamental piece of how we've tried to engage with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledges in a meaningful way in this process. And we're also interested in this idea of cultivating ethical space. And part of that has been making room in our meetings, for example, for Indigenous elders to open our meetings with opening words or thoughts or prayer to help to build that ethical space for the kinds of conversations that we're having about doing this work together, leaning here into this idea, you might say, of Indigenous methodology or Indigenous protocol around how this quote unquote should be done in a good way. So that's been those have been important aspects of the work. Another piece that I wanted to flag is this idea in the Canadian Mountain Assessment that yes, we will have a text-based content, we will have a book, but we really want to have ample opportunities for knowledges that are shared or gifted to the assessment to be represented in the most appropriate way possible. And what that means for us is that we want to have a lot of visual content in the assessment to start, but also things like embedded hyperlinks, where there might be some text introducing knowledge is shared by an elder, for example, but the text representation of that conversation is not going to be the most appropriate way to share that knowledge. And so we'll have embedded links to things like audio recordings of that conversation, where oral histories, for example, can be accessed in a rich and as close as true to form way as possible. And that's been something that's been suggested to us and gifted to us by our Indigenous advisors in particular, as a way to work respectively with knowledge systems that are not always most appropriately represented in a text-based form.
This question is for you, Carolina. You've been actively involved with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which is a body of the United Nations focused on assessing the scientific evidence on human-induced climate change to help support policymaking. Specifically, you were a lead author on the High Mountain Areas chapter of the 2019 IPCC Special Report on Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate, as well as a co-lead on the just-released IPCC cross-chapter paper on mountains. So with all of that experience, what was unique and important about the chapters that you worked on, and what role or what were your roles with them?
So what's unique and important about these mountain chapters? First of all, it's important to recognize that these chapters provide a very useful platform in which to bring mountain-oriented and mountain-focused content in such a prominent and highly influential document such as the IPCC, at least at the global scale. And this hasn't been possible, not since the IPCC's last dedicated content on mountains, which was part of the second assessment report, which was released back in 1996. So there's been quite a considerable gap in terms of relevant changes that are being experienced and seen and reported in the literature. By that I mean scientific research, which needed to be brought in an updated sense into this assessment as well. And what is also important to recognize and is unique about these two particular chapters is the integrated approach taken to look at mountains as human and biophysical system as well. And to look at the changes that we've observed that arise through a changing climate. For instance, the warming temperatures that appear to have a much more accelerated signal in mountain or elevated regions. And as to your second question about the roles, my role as lead author was to work as part of a team. And it's important to emphasize here the name team, the word team, because it's been hundreds and hundreds of lead authors involved in the production of such a report. And it's a very diverse group of individuals, particularly in the chapters that we dealt with for mountains. These were individuals from various countries, as well as scientific disciplinary backgrounds. So working in a highly interdisciplinary and mixed setting had, of course, its challenges, but also a great, incredible opportunity to engage and grow as a scholar, and also for those that are looking to engage more with policymakers. And our main task was simply to take stock of the evidence presented in the thousands of published research papers and other reports that have been reporting the changes related to climate change, but also the responses to those changes and the impacts associated with those, and consolidate those findings in this reports by taking a global approach to those findings. And it's important to also recognize that the primary audience for these reports have largely been oriented around policymakers and those that are tasked with the undertaking climate negotiations, for example, within the context of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But increasingly over the years, we've also seen the relevance of these reports to inform and support more regional assessments, but also as a means to conduct outreach and engagement with broader society, and to be able to engage scientific work also as part of that.
I'm going to move to Philippus now. So you were the coordinator and lead editor of the 2019 Hindu Kush Himalaya assessment, as well as a contributor to various IPCC assessment activities, including co-lead of the cross-chapter paper on mountains together with Carolina. So I want to focus on the Hindu Kush Himalaya assessment. Why was this assessment so significant, and what did your leadership role involve?
I think similar to the Canadian Mountain Assessment, this was the first time for the Hindu Kush Himalaya that an assessment was done to really figure out what's happening in this region. Now, it was modeled inspired by previous IPCC assessments, IPBES assessments, and other assessments, but this had never been done on a regional mountain scale. So when the assessments started to come together started actually in 2013-14, and then really picked up steam in 2016, it was really at the request of the 8 countries, sharing the Hindu Kush Himalaya, the member countries of ICIMOD, putting it to us that, you do all this great work and all this great research and you publish all this stuff, but could you produce a go-to book wherein everything, is brought together? And I think the assessment did that. And I think what was significant there was very much it was requested by the region. It was done for the region. And importantly, the authors, 80% of the 210 authors were drawn from the region. So this gave it a real ownership, and this immediately gave it an audience, and it gave a form of science to science regional, collaboration across borders with, people from India, Pakistan, China, Afghanistan, Myanmar, you name it. These 8 countries all getting together and sharing and trying to understand. And, there's 240 million people living in the Hindu Kush Himalaya mountain region. Now, mind you, this includes low-lying areas, right? This is not just everything, right in the mountains, but it's a large region, 240 million people. And that's significant. Now, globally, we are looking at 1.3 billion people living in mountain regions. So that's what the cross-chapter paper on mountains shows in the latest IPCC Working Group 2 report. So these are very significant numbers. But we find the visibility and the recognition is quite low. And I think the Canadian Mountain Assessment is also, pushing or working on getting more visibility and recognition. And, Graham himself was saying, it turns out the area of mountain regions in Canada is like 50 times Switzerland. Well, there you go. We all know Switzerland is a mountainous region, right? And Carolina can attest to that, sitting there in Zurich and looking at the Alps. But Who would have thought Canada had that many mountains, right? So I think there's a lot of issues around visibility recognition and taking action. So it was significant for those regions. Now, in terms of my role, being the lead editor, being the coordinator, what did that involve? It involved, I think, three things, and I think Graham was already mentioning that. It involves humility, working with people, trying to see where to go, not having a prefixed idea of this is what I want to see, but having that, holding that space to see what will emerge if we put 50 brilliant minds in a room, what will emerge, and trusting that process, and going with that process, and then when it gets stuck, or when it gets messy, or when it gets difficult, to know that this is the way these processes work. And, there's that messy middle where everybody disagrees, and that's okay, because you need to work through that disagreement to get to that deeper level of figuring out, so why do you disagree, or what is it that you don't like about this, or how do you feel you are not being heard, or so probing deeper to figure out, are we really disagreeing here, or haven't we gone deeply enough into the process to figure out where it is we want to be going?
I have another question for both of you. How would you say that your experiences from past mountain focus assessments that we just went over extensively, how have those experiences informed the way you are advising on the Canadian mountain assessments?
What comes to mind is the criteria by which authors have been assessing the evidence that's then consolidated and presented in these reports. The experience that we've had in the IPCC is that those particular protocols and guidelines fulfill a very specific purpose. And in taking into consideration how the Canadian mountain assessment has been conceptualized and designed, the experience had with how we've implemented those guidelines to incorporate diversity in terms of evidence assessed had its limits. And I think one of the key things that I've been able to voice and also highlight in my advice in this particular Canadian context was that particular attention needs to be given to the guidelines and criteria by which we value and characterize certain knowledge or knowledge types as being valuable for the assessment, as contributing to the evidence that provides a rigorous conclusion. So I think that was an important experience to convey, and I'm very pleased to see that also the way in which the IPCC, for instance, taking a more consensus approach to reaching conclusions, perhaps may not be as amenable when you have other contexts that take a less political approach, but rather take into account different forms of knowledge for different framings and different ways of articulating the value of mountains beyond what it provides to us. So I think that was a key aspect, and which forced us to also think about the limits to certain ways of knowing within the scientific domain. And in itself, it has its limits and ability to really portray or highlight what is important to consider for decision making.
Yeah, I think I would add to that, Carolina. It's indeed. I think that was also in advising to the Canadian Mountain Assessment to say, yes, there's all this experience, there's the Kush Himalayan assessment, there's the IPCC work, but you do have a unique moment to really reflect on how to structure this assessment, how to respectfully and with humility, engage Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous peoples, and try to work that through. Which I think has been done very well in the Canadian Mountain Assessment, although it's still ongoing. But I think what Carolina was indicating, there's certain templates that work for certain contexts, and I'm not sure, it's about gold standards. There's different ways of doing assessments with different audiences in mind. And I think, yeah, in having had the privilege to, participate in several of these meetings of the International Advisory Committee, and also with the elders, to really reflect on that it's a unique journey. And what is relevant for Canada, what is urgent for Canada, what is salient for Canada is that will emerge out of the process. So and I think that the way the assessment has been going forward is a testimony to that.
So we've gone over quite extensively about past experiences with other mountain assessments and what the CMA itself has been doing over the past 2 years. But I kind of wanted to look or focus on what it looks like going forward. So Graham, the Canadian Mountain Assessment is scheduled to end, or is scheduled to be completed by October 2023. So over the next year and a half, what activities will you be undertaking with the Canadian Mountain Assessment, like between now and that endpoint?
As I mentioned earlier in the conversation, we are now in the section preparation stage. So really that point in time where we are doing the work of the assessment. And we're very excited to now be looking at having 2 in-person events in Banff in May of this year. And the first of those is what we are calling a learning circle. And this is part of the methodology that has been co-created in this process to invite in Indigenous understandings of mountains. They will also be events that, with permission of participants, we will record and will generate some of that embedded content that I mentioned earlier, so recordings of conversations, for example. There'll also be an opportunity for Learning Circle participants to become authors of the assessment if they so choose, in recognition of the legitimate role that these knowledge holders and knowledge contributors are playing in the process. And importantly, it will also be an opportunity for us to really emphasize our commitment to supporting Indigenous peoples' right to carefully check what of their knowledges are included in the final assessment. So before anything from Learning Circles is shared out publicly, there'll be opportunities for those individuals and their communities as appropriate to review what has been shared and to authorize that can be brought into the assessment. In addition to that Learning Circle, we're hosting our first in-person author meeting, and Flip has really been so focused on us doing this, and I'm so glad that we're finally able to do it, because I really see and have heard from him the importance of this kind of gathering, and I'm really eager to see how this meeting of minds helps to push the project forward in a meaningful way. So we'll also be inviting in authors from across the country, multiple authors from each of the assessment sections, to begin doing some of that applied work and building those relationships in a deeper way and creating the inertia we need to get this project done in the time that we have available. We, in the fall of 2022 through to early 2023, will first put the assessment out for review and then have a period of revisions. And our review process is also unique, I think, for the CMA. So part of the multiple evidence-based approach that is the way we conceptualize this work is a commitment to knowledge contributions being assessed within the knowledge systems from which they emerge. And this gets to the point Carolina was making about guidelines and criteria. And so here we're trying to make space for a variety of people and organizations to be involved in reviewing the assessment, not just the academic community. And so the assessment will go out for a period of review to the academic community, of course, but also to Indigenous individuals, communities, organizations, as appropriate. And then we will have a period of revisions where we will work to incorporate the suggestions. Here again is a opportunity to check in on any of the Indigenous contributions that perhaps have been thought of as being appropriate, but perhaps will be identified as something that shouldn't be shared out more broadly, and gives us a chance again to make sure that we're not putting things into the world that would not be appropriate to put out. So we look forward to these checks and balances in our process.
All right, so yeah, my final question, what would you all say will be the most important impacts of the Canadian Mountain Assessment in terms of advancing the understanding of mountains in particular and knowledge assessment activities more broadly?
For me, when I think about the question you've asked, I guess some of the key things in terms of impact are really this idea of providing clarity about, potentially where we know a lot about certain geographies or topics in relation to mountains in Canada, but also where we have some of these really consequential knowledge gaps. And relatedly, I think the assessment's going to help clarify what needs to happen in terms of addressing some of these key gaps going forward.
I think if I can add something to the extensive list of impact-oriented areas that we would like to see this assessment fulfill. One of them is around the next 10 years. This is what's often referred to as the decade, a crucial decade of action, not just at the country level, but also globally. So for me, what I'm really looking to see is the impact of the Canadian assessment within this call for urgent action, and how much of that actually translates to very tangible action on the ground, and how the political system and the political engagement that's necessary to bring about that action is mobilized and inspired by what this report can also help guide and inform. So this will be a crucial decade to look into, and let's see how the legacy of this report can be sustained beyond its publication date. I think it's important to recognize that such valuable resources and contributions have an opportunity to live beyond the date on which they are published.
I would say linking to other assessment processes. So I know in Canada there is a national climate change assessment process ongoing. So many countries do this. Interestingly, some countries like Australia have never done a national assessment of climate change, right? So there's things that are difficult to understand. But anyway, I think in Canada that's ongoing. And I think there's a way of how the contributions of the Canadian Mountain Assessment, how that can be brought into the national processes, both assessment processes, but then also into the policy and practice space. And also importantly, and I think Graham was already pointing to that, is the research agenda. Importantly, an assessment tells you what you don't know. And what you don't know, your knowledge gaps, you can then prioritize to see, what should we be focusing on? What is critically important that we need to deepen our knowledge of, our understanding of.
That was Graham Mcdowell, Carolina Adler, and Philippus Wester, 3 members of the Canadian Mountain Assessment. Right now, the CMA has largely completed the planning and development stage of the project and is fully in the process of preparing assessment sections, and the assessment will be launched in fall of 2023. That's it for this edition of the Canadian Mountain Podcast in partnership with Mount Royal University. Thank you for listening. This podcast was produced from Treaty 7 territories, a place that holds generations of culture and stories. With the Canadian Mountain Podcast, our goal is to share both Indigenous knowledge and settler perspectives, and we give appreciation to those stories. We are committed to collaborating with Indigenous peoples through storytelling and partnerships. Therefore, we acknowledge the hereditary keepers of these lands, the Niitsitapi, Iahe Nakota, Tsuut'ina, and Métis peoples. I'm Ethan Ward, and special thanks to show producer Gabrielle Pisca. Be sure to join us again for more stories surrounding mountain places, whether that be in your own backyard or from around the country. Share and subscribe to get the latest updates on the new season, and be sure to tell your mountain-loving friends and colleagues. You can find us wherever you find your podcasts, and you can learn more about the Canadian Mountain Network at canadianmountaintnetwork.ca.